Vulkan is the best Primarch that ever Primarched, and it has taken me a long time to come around to that, but that's where I stand. This demigod son of the Emperor of mankind's perpetuality is often seen as his most defining characteristic, but there's so much more to the Lord of Drakes than just his immortal status. In all of Warhammer 40k lore, Vulkan is the best-natured, the kindest, the purest of heart, the physically strongest, and he cannot die. And that's just the beginning of the list of things that set this Primarch apart, miles apart, from his brothers. If there ever was a son of the Emperor that could be called a good man, it was Vulkan, the Primarch whose heart bleeds for humanity, and who would sacrifice himself and his legion to do the right thing by the citizens of the Imperium. His honor, courage, and discipline are far beyond impeachable, and his sense of duty to humanity is one of the most human characteristics that Games Workshop ever bestowed upon a Primarch. And sure, Vulkan has a dark side, and he can do the most evil, vile, and despicable things, just as any of the Emperor's generals. But with the Primarch of the 18th Legion of the Adeptus Astartes, the Salamanders, we see a nobility that is beyond reproach and a loyalty that cannot be questioned, because it cannot fail, nor even falter. The Emperor found Vulkan on a world that pretty much sucked, Nocturne, but the Lord of Drakes was making the best of it, being an awesome blacksmith and beating the crap out of Dark Eldar raiders who were taking advantage of his people. The usual Emperor meeting one of his lost sons shenanigans ensued, and the Emperor was kind of playing down who he was, just pretending to be some dude from space or whatever. So they competed to see who was more swole, and they hunted the wild great lizards of Nocturne known as Salamanders. The whole thing reads like a folk tale, a legend or myth, kind of gave me Paul Bunyan or John Henry vibes. And that's what it should be. The Emperor reuniting with his demigod son should definitely be folklore level, shrouded in myth and legend, but possibly containing a sliver of truth that made it through the millennia. But if we take it literally then, well, you get my point. So the Emperor saved Vulkan by throwing his giant space lizard into the lava to save them both. By default, Vulkan won the contest, but he still took a knee in front of the Emperor as it was revealed who he was. It was all symbolic and whatever. But we see that selflessness that defines Vulkan on full display by his father, who bequeathed that aspect upon his son. So the Primarch is reunited with his usually psychotic, but currently acting in a rather stand-up way, Space Father, the Emperor of Mankind, and he's given the 18th Legion, as he's the 18th Primarch. And that legion was appropriately named the Dragon Warriors, but then they changed it to the Salamanders in honor of the giant space lava lizards of Nocturne in the meeting of the Emperor and Vulkan. So everyone thinks that Vulkan is awesome, and his sons totally respect him, but they're a truly wild and super ferocious bunch. Like, they literally took 80% casualties just because they didn't know to stop fighting. They won, but almost all of them died. So they were a committed lot, and the Primarch taught them new ways to fight, including self-preservation techniques such as not dying endlessly to achieve nothing, and getting out of the way of enemy fire. And such novel ideas as taking care not to cause civilian casualties and compassion for the regular humans, which were extremely progressive values for their time. Vulkan truly believed that all lives matter. Well, at least human lives. But Vulkan spent a long time with the Emperor, many years in fact, before being reunited with his legion. And he had newer Marines that came from Nocturne, not from Terra. But when he met his sons who were out crusading in the name of the Emperor while he was getting caught up on all the goings-on of the galaxy outside of his little bubble of Nocturne, Vulkan knelt before his sons, not allowing them to kneel before him. He was like, "Thanks for being out there kicking all that ass so that we could all be chilling and enjoying life safely," basically saying, "Thanks for your service." But it was really interesting that when the Terran-born Marines went to Nocturne, they started to turn really dark like the other Salamanders and the Primarch. Something within their gene seed made it happen. But it's awesome. It protects them from all the harmful rays of Nocturne's sun, and it makes them look like warp demons with unnaturally black skin and red eyes. They look totally awesome, like something out of a horror movie. And yet they're the nicest Marines out there. But even though Vulkan is completely the nicest Primarch, and even though he taught his legion that protecting the innocent was the right thing to do, and that they were the shield that protects the Imperium, It was their duty to protect the weak. Even though all that, he's still a cold-blooded killer, general of legions at heart, and he did just that one time, just that once, do something just a little amoral, just a little bit. Yeah, I'm talking about when he burned that Eldar child alive. It scarred him, and he thought he had no other choice, really. It was a moral conundrum, after all, and a very emotional response to losing someone he generally loved and seeing her broken body lying dead, done in by the Drukhari. So Vulkan can get real grimdark if he needs to. And despite how awesome he is, if something was in the way of him getting his job done, or doing his duty, then he wouldn't be deterred by it. But yeah, he felt really bad about it later. But you know, most of his brothers would tell him not to even waste a moment thinking about a filthy Xenos, child or not. Then again, it can be said that without the Eldari, several times throughout the lore, the Imperium of Man would not have endured. But that is a topic for another video, it sounds like. So Vulkan is all crusady and taking the fight to the galaxy. His legion is a little replenished and he's doing pretty good out there. He got a later start than many of his brothers, but he's conquering systems and bringing them into compliance in the name of his father, the Emperor of Mankind, and he's out there doing his best, being the best he can be, and he's still an artist at heart, which is something I really love about Vulkan. Perturabo and Ferrus Manus get all the recognition for being awesome smiths, but Vulkan was literally the smith of all smiths, and Vulkan crafted the baddest hammer ever, rivaling even Forgebreaker. This hammer is called Dawnbringer, and Vulkan uses it to smash tons of enemies. The hammer is said to be indestructible, but after using it for a while, the Primarch intended to gift it to his brother Horus. It was supposed to be a symbol of his recognition of his brother's rank and status as War Master. But Vulkan felt that there was something off with Horus. Something really messed up, like his vibe was totally off. Yeah, Vulkan was a very empathic dude. So when he felt his brother was off, he knew he was right about it. Horus teamed Vulkan up with Kurz and the Night Lords, and the Salamanders' Primarch should have known that he couldn't change Kurz, but he tried. The seeds of enmity were sown, and Kurz rejected Vulkan's methods. And Vulkan, well, he was absolutely disgusted with how the Night Lords used terror tactics. So yeah, Vulkan had honor and he hated terrorism. So of course he wasn't going to get along with Conrad Kurz. But one thing that I think about Vulkan that you'll probably never hear anyone else say is that Vulkan was an absolute 100% bona fide heretic. He wrote a lot and mixed ancient Terran mysticism and spiritual practices with the culture and lifestyle of Nocturne and came up with his own cult, basically. He implemented the belief system he advocated into his legion, and the Salamanders all became members of the Promethean cult. And to me, the Prometheans, while wildly considered an acceptable variant of the Imperial cult by the Ecclesiarchy in the modern setting of Warhammer 40k, well, they were full-blown heretics in 30k. The Imperial truth was the only truth acceptable in that time, during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. The Imperium was hardcore atheist, and Vulkan's belief system incorporated several heretical beliefs. The soul, for example, was held to be true and actually exists by the Prometheans. But there are scholars who believe that the Salamanders were not tempted to join Chaos due to the Promethean cult for multiple reasons. First, since the entirety of the Salamanders' legion were in the cult together, the warrior lodges that corrupted the traitor legions from within did not take root in the Salamanders. They already had their own warrior culture with its own mythos. And second, the Salamanders already had a spiritual belief system. They didn't need to join any Chaos cult. They were already in the Promethean cult. No need to join Heaven's Gate if you're already a Scientologist, you know? So yeah, to me, Vulkan was running around conquering worlds for the Emperor and his atheist empire while secretly indoctrinating his sons into his cult. Let's check out what their creed is. The Promethean Creed. Ours is a violent calling, but as adherents of the Promethean Creed, we believe in the circle of fire. None can come back as they once were, but in death we are returned to the ash from whence we came to be born anew, our blood and bone bonded with the earth. Through fire are our enemies made Protean. Through fire and the reunion with earth do we experience rebirth. After death, after our duty is ended, we give ourselves to these elements and in so doing become a part of them. This is the nature of the circle of fire. And they have all sorts of little sayings and mantras they use constantly, reminding themselves to keep their heads in the indoctrination game. Without wisdom, skill cannot be focused. Without skill, strength cannot be brought to bear. Without strength, wisdom cannot be applied. From the teachings of the Promethean cult. But despite being a heretic on the down low, preaching his weirdo pseudo-religious creed, Vulkan was one awesome Primarch. And Horus betraying the entirety of humanity came down really hard on Vulkan and the Salamanders. At Istvan V, the drop site massacre happened, and the Salamanders, the Raven Guard, and the Iron Hands were nearly all but erased entirely. Ferrus Manus got decapitated, and Corvus Corax barely made it out alive. And Vulkan, well, he got straight up nuked by the Iron Warriors. And that is how he, and we, found out that Vulkan was a perpetual. Now, if you read the original lore on this, the old Horus Heresy Black books, then you look at Book 2, Massacre, you'll see that it describes this scene and states that only 5 Marines in total escaped. 5? I mean, in that original lore, it was stated that there were only like 30,000 combatants between both sides, loyalist and traitor, but that nearly comprised all of several entire legions. But yeah, really glad they updated that 5 guys escaped into at least 5,000 Raven Guard or so alone. I mean, if I remember correctly, that was 4 Salamanders and 1 lone Raven Guard who escaped Istvan V with their lives in the original lore. But Vulkan got nuked, and his sons were mostly obliterated. And yeah, he found himself facing off against the Iron Warriors and Night Lords. And they killed him. At least, he thought they did. They stabbed him up a bunch and shot him and beat him to unconsciousness. Curse took Vulkan prisoner, and he, being the total psycho he is, tortured Vulkan endlessly. When he went to kill his brother, Vulkan just regenerated, no matter what the Night Haunter did. And there was some pretty grim stuff. He decapitated Vulkan, of course. He tore his brother limb from limb. He put him into space naked, put him in the engine of a starship and burned him up. I mean, Kurz got creative and even used a fork on his brother. But Vulkan just wouldn't break, and Kurz was going crazy trying to kill him and endlessly failing. By this time, it was obvious to both Primarchs that the Emperor had bestowed upon his 18th son the greatest of abilities. Perpetuality. Kurz cannot break Vulkan, not at all. He tries psychological torture. He tries endless games where Vulkan has to exert himself physically and mentally for as long as he can, holding off the inevitable, which usually ended with the death of innocence. But Vulkan just wouldn't break. He was completely indestructible of will and body both. But Kurz did some really gnarly stuff, and yet Vulkan was as stubborn as an anvil. So Kurz decides to have some fun with Vulkan and teach him a lesson. He puts Vulkan in a labyrinth that was designed by Perturabo, and hidden in the labyrinth was Vulkan's hammer, Dawnbringer. He keeps hunting Vulkan throughout the maze and killing him and just playing mind games, basically being Kurz at his worst, and Vulkan finally finds Dawnbringer, and he's stoked. When he'd made the hammer, he'd put a teleport homer in the handle, and was thinking that he'd activate that and travel right to his ship and away from Kurz. But Kurz knew it was there and had deactivated it. The whole maze, the labyrinth, had been a game. And Vulkan gave Kurz one of the greatest dressing downs of all time. He totally destroyed any notion of Kurz being on the level of the other Primarchs. He straight up lets Conrad know that he's a bitch, and gets Dawnbringer. And he tells Kurz that he knew the whole time that the Night Haunter's ego would make him have to face Vulkan one last time. And then he lets Kurz know that it's cool if the teleport is broken because he's forgetting one thing. Kurz asks what, and then Vulkan delivers one of the greatest one-liners in 40k. It's also a hammer. And if you've watched some of my other videos, then you'll know I absolutely love one-liners, especially ones that are just dripping with testosterone and action hero level badassery. But yeah, Vulkan's reply is definitely up there with Solomon Akura telling Karn the Betrayer, "I am Alpharius and I am your death." It's a straight up balls of steel moment. Then Vulkan beats the absolute crap out of Kurz with Dawnbringer. I mean, it is kind of hard to imagine that kind of beatdown, and it came with that berating, hyper-focused, righteous indignation that only Vulkan could bring. I mean, then in the most alpha move ever, Vulkan won't even dignify Kurz enough to end his life. He leaves him just shattered, absolutely smashed, and is like, "You aren't worthy of killing, scum." I mean, Vulkan says the meanest things a brother can say. He let Kurz know that his upbringing and what he'd been through weren't the cause of his delusions and insanity, and let him know that he was the gimpiest Primarch by far, just by the odds. One of them was likely to be flawed. Vulkan told Kurz that he himself was made the physically strongest by the Emperor, and let Kurz know that he was the only Primarch that the Emperor gave no boons to. It was brutally harsh for sure, and before the beating even commenced, to the man who is fear himself, Vulkan stated that none of his brothers fear him. They all laugh at him. They all pity him. This was probably the single meanest thing Vulkan did to Kurz. As he kept screaming about how he's the Night Haunter and he's fear itself, I literally imagined a juggalo putting on his face paint and telling his brother that he only goes by Night Haunter now, and Vulkan just looks at him and just can't take him seriously and then puts him in a headlock. But the beatdown, it was like Ralphie versus Scott Farkas. I mean, it was bad, and Kurz deserved it for sure. I can't say that Vulkan didn't do a little bullying, but after what Kurz put him through and the countless physical deaths, some of which were really extreme, Conrad Kurz did deserve anything and everything he got. So Vulkan emerged victorious over his brother, and he was then aware of his perpetuality, but he was still a Promethean, and in my eyes, a heretic. But he only let his brother live because Kurz was trying to prove to Vulkan that he was right and they were both equally immoral. I mean, this guy was always on a death trip trying to prove something to someone. But when Vulkan then is able to activate his teleporter, he teleports to Macragge and falls from the upper atmosphere and burns up on the way in. When the Ultramarines find his charred remains, they didn't recognize him. They thought that a statue had fallen from space. He was so burned up and unrecognizable. But eventually he rejuvenated, and he was crazy when he came to. Totally insane, trying to attack anyone and everyone. And Guilliman was not happy. Eventually Vulkan raids the armory and goes after Kurz, who was actually on Macragge because the Dark Angels had captured him, and he escaped their flagship using a drop pod to get to the planet's surface. So round 2 of Kurz versus Vulkan was on Guilliman's home turf no less. They fought like two raging gods, smashing their way through an entire city. And by this time, Vulkan was well aware of his perpetuality, so he basically just tried to focus on that, and he found that when he really concentrated, he could regenerate much faster. Still didn't stop Kurz from blowing Vulkan's head off, but the cool thing was that Vulkan's body fell off a cliff and his head regenerated before he hit the ground. He was getting that good at it. But this is where things go south for the Promethean. John Grammaticus shows up on the orders of those shady fools he worked for, the Cabal. You know, the Xenos cult that is obsessed with Horus winning the war. They first showed up in Legion and corrupted the Alpha Legion, or did they? And Grammaticus thinks he's going to give a Fulgurite spear to Conrad Kurz so he can use it to permanently kill Vulkan. But Eldred Ulthrin of Craftworld Ulthwé, probably the greatest and strongest Farseer that the Eldari have ever produced, contacted Grammaticus and told him to use the Fulgurite on Vulkan himself. And he stated that doing so would kill Vulkan and Grammaticus both, allowing John to finally die. And it did sort of work. John Grammaticus stabbed Vulkan and there was an explosion and they both died, but John regenerated as he always did. But when he came back, he knew it was his last life and there would be no more continues. Vulkan didn't recover though. So he was sealed in a sarcophagus that Guilliman made, and it said Unbound Flame on it. Very touching, Guilliman really showing that he's a solid bro. I know a lot of the Primarchs didn't like him much, but he sure did show that he loved Vulkan, and I think he honored him pretty well. But you know, Vulkan had way more to do, so of course eventually he woke up. He was taken to Nocturne by the Salamanders and resurrected in a blood sacrifice ritual where the Salamanders' cult beliefs of the Promethean persuasion came into play in a real way. The first captain, Artilus Numian, sacrificed himself to resurrect his Primarch. And it worked. The Salamanders were down to around 700 to 800 total legionnaires, and they were all in attendance at Vulkan's funeral. The Promethean cult rites were performed and the whole chapter was branded, and they lowered Vulkan's body into magma and Mount Deathfire. Yes, it is literally Mount Deathfire, which is actually totally badass and also kind of straight out of a parody. But Vulkan still had the blade of the Fulgurite spear in his chest, as nobody could physically remove it. The Promethean cult leader basically was like the main chaplain, told the first company captain, Numian, to take over the leadership and be the new head of the Salamanders Legion. But he refused, saying Vulkan was the only one who could lead them back into the war. And nothing had happened. Now, they went through a lot to get Vulkan's body back to Nocturne. And that deserves its own separate video. But the Salamanders faced traitors on the way, and Artilus was asked by Magnus the Red what he would sacrifice to see his Primarch reborn. As Artilus was thinking upon this, he realized the answer was not that he would sacrifice anything and everything most willingly to bring Vulkan back, but that he had to sacrifice everything, meaning his life. So he wandered out into the wasteland and threw himself down a lava shaft into the magma. His homies went out searching and didn't find him, but after days of looking they thought they finally did. Except when they got closer, they found that it was Vulkan, disoriented and weak with a spear still sticking out of his chest. Now, the reason that the spear had been able to kill him was it was Fulgurite, which in 40k means it is a shard of the Emperor's psychic abilities frozen into a solid state, a literal psychic bolt that can end Primarchs. But Vulkan was back, like Prometheus from mythology. He did resurrect, and like Prometheus, he suffered. An endless cycle of it, actually. You know, nobody had probably suffered as bad as Vulkan in the entirety of the setting, but Vulkan's suffering was only just about to begin. He's going to crank it up to 11 million, because the Lord of Drakes has to get back to Terra, and that was not a fun journey. So the 3 Marines who found Vulkan were told not to reveal his return to his legion, which I think was lame, but they got named the Drax Ward, and their names are Attic-Abitibi? Sorry. Their names are Attic-Abitimi, Barakxitos, and Eigengargo. And oh my god, that was so hard to say. Salamanders seem to have some pretty weird names, which is cool, I guess. But yeah, Vulkan, when he resurrected, but before his Drax Ward found him, was deep inside Mount Deathfire. And Sauron was forging the Ring of Power and just seeing if you're still paying attention. But Vulkan is totally disoriented, basically walking around in a dreamlike fugue. And he meets this old man who calls himself Deathfire. And he tells Vulkan that he really should travel to Terra to see the Emperor. But then he shows Vulkan to 2 artifacts, claiming that Vulkan had forged them, even though the Primarch had no memory of it. Everyone thought he was dead, but he was just in the heart of Mount Doom, a volcano, and was forging away. So the items in question are the awesome and amazing warhammer called Urdrakul and the Talisman of 7 Hammers. And Vulkan is able to use the talisman to open a webway portal deep within Nocturne. Anyway, he and his homies, the Drax Ward, bounce to head out to Terra. But mad fools front on them, and they end up fighting Dark Eldar and Kamara before making their way through the webway and getting to Shadrach Medusan of the Iron Hands' fleet. And this is something I covered in my recent video about the most grimdark moments in Warhammer 40k. And this one's up there. But it turns out the Salamanders aren't the only loyalist Space Marine Legion that is secretly fronting for a cult. But instead of the Prometheans, which, let's be honest, cult or not, in opposition to the Imperial truth or not, their weirdo cult beliefs work. I mean, Vulkan did resurrect. Or did he? Maybe he was fine the whole time and was just down there forging. But the Iron Hands, yes, they have the cult of the Gorgon. And these fools were tripping. I mean, straight up on some whacked out trip. where they thought they were resurrecting their dead Primarch Ferrus Manus. And when Vulkan was introduced to what Medusan was calling Ferrus, he saw one of his dead brother's necrodermis-covered arms attached to an automaton body, seemingly controlled by a heretical AI. But I mean, Vulkan was pissed. Being presented with such an abomination and told it was his dead brother whose life was lost on Istvan. And just as a side note, because I have to get this out, but why is it that when we think of legions or chapters that hate the Iron Warriors, we think Imperial fists? But they literally nuked the Salamanders out of existence. Just saying, Salamanders might not hold a grudge, but they also don't stand for whack, janky tripe like a dead Primarch's arm duct taped to a servitor being called the resurrection of Ferrus Manus. If you're going to join a cult, avoid the Gorgons with every fiber of your being. You're better off in Scientology or even the OTO than that. But yeah, Vulkan, he treated the abomination before him to a nice hammering as if it were Conrad Curse. It was completely destroyed. Even the arm of Ferrus that was attached, which was thought to be completely indestructible. But the hammer, your Dracula, obliterated it. Vulkan and his boys left, telling the Iron Hands that they were tripping and that they were broken, and basically he felt sorry for them, more or less. He refused to take part in Medusan's war, even though they were fighting the Sons of Horus. I probably would too. Golas are offensive, and the Ferrus Manus one, that's really scummy. But this is exactly why I don't like the Iron Hands as much as the other legions. They're by far my least favorite legion, and it's because of this and their undead zombie space marines who are borderline servitors, basically their army of Robocops, that I find I don't love them as much. When I say that a certain faction's fans always get butthurt, but even when I go out of my way to say that I love all the legions, just I love the 10th the least, I'd tell these people they're not only in a cult, but the wrong cult. So Vulkan and the Draxward bounce and get on their way back to Terra, and on the way they meet up with some Eldar who are working for Eldred Ulthrin, and they help Vulkan get into the webway and go towards Terra. Vulkan finds himself going from Caldera, where he met the Eldar, to the webway and into the impossible city, Kalistar. A very special place in the Warhammer 40k lore, and I promise you will be featuring heavily going forward over the next few years. In the impossible city, he fights demons, and comes face to face with a great unclean one, Agalbor. And usually a greater demon of Nurgle is an insane opponent, and it was, but the Talisman of Seven Hammers isn't just a talisman. It is a WMD, and with it Vulkan slew Agalbor. Not just physically, but within the warp as well. To demons, who are usually completely immortal and exist outside of space and time, this is known as true death, and they are completely obliterated. Still, the Primarch and the Draxward were harried by demons to the point of being overwhelmed. But then the old man, Deathfire, shows up and reveals that he's Eldred Ulthrin, and he tells Vulkan the Emperor has sealed the portal to the Imperial dungeon. So he opens a new portal and transports Vulkan to the gates of the Imperial Palace. So he got a ride all the way home, after a few minor run-ins. Nothing he couldn't handle. Rogal Dorn was happy to see his brother, but the Custodes came and got Vulkan and said the Emperor wanted to see him. And they took Vulkan to the Emperor on the Golden Throne. The Emperor told him the talisman could destroy all of Terra, and he had to be the man to hold it because he was basically the most patient and reluctant to use his powers of all the Primarchs. Vulkan was the only one who could be trusted to hold the trigger to the last resort WMD that would take everyone out and deny Terra to chaos. The Emperor let Vulkan know that not only was he expected, but his arrival and entire journey to Terra had been being looked over by the Emperor from the throne, and that Vulkan was compelled to create the Ur-Dracula, I can't even say it right, Ur-Dracul and Talisman of Seven Hammers by the Emperor's will. Vulkan's entire purpose was revealed. His whole life came down to being the man to activate the Dead Man's Switch, the Talisman of Seven Hammers, during the final battle, should the Loyalists lose. Vulkan installed the device into the Golden Throne, and went to man the Eternity Gate. But Vulkan had another fight in him before the Siege of Terra was over, and when Magnus the Red and his sorcerers entered the Imperial Palace to assassinate the Emperor, it was Vulkan who stepped forward to block Magnus's blade with his super hammer. They exchanged some words, and Magnus tries to manipulate Vulkan. Then the Emperor offers Magnus redemption, because he knew he failed his son and caused a lot of strife and turmoil because of some mishandling of certain information. But along with this, there's a balancing of the scales and the fact that in order to gain this redemption, Magnus must be cool with his entire legion being destroyed, as the mutation of their gene seed was too much and the flesh change couldn't be cured. Magnus refused, and Vulkan agreed that if he were in Magnus's place, he would refuse as well. But still, he defended the Emperor against the Red Cyclops and gave him a mega beatdown. At this point, call me a sadist or whatever you want, but I kind of get off on Vulkan clobbering other Primarchs with big hammers. During the fight, because Magnus was the only Primarch who could come close to rivaling Vulkan in strength, and that was mostly due to him being able to appear as whatever size he needed to be, Magnus didn't just go down like a bitch. He would have pierced Vulkan with a deadly strike, but Beric Xytos sacrificed himself to take the blow. This sent Vulkan into a rage, seeing his son cut down like that. So he takes up Xytos' Thunder Hammer and dual wields hammers at Magnus and just unleashes. I mean, as physically strong as Magnus is, or psychically strong as Magnus is, he couldn't do anything about it, really. Vulkan was a volcano of hammers erupting all over Magnus. But before Vulkan delivers the killing blow, Magnus accepts chaos, turning to Tzeentch and becoming his thrall. Magnus was immediately expelled from the Imperial Palace by the wards in place that repelled demons, and he had become a demon Primarch. And that saved his life, as Vulkan didn't get to smash him with you are Dracula. That's what I'm calling it from now on. The Eternity Gate is besieged by the traitor forces, and Malcador lets Vulkan know that Magnus has gone into the webway and is enacting a ritual to sap the Emperor's energy away, stealing what strength remained in him. He'd been on the Golden Throne for a long time by this point. If I recall correctly, about a decade or more. So Vulkan goes into the webway and back to the Impossible City, and there he meets the demon Primarch of Tzeentch, Magnus the Red, who had been taunting and goading Vulkan on his entire journey through the webway. If you're a fan of cosmic horror, then the Impossible City is basically Carcosa. Then they had another fight, and this one was epic. At first, Magnus is hiding back and doing his ritual while a smoke version of him is fighting Vulkan. But Vulkan eventually gets the upper hand and interrupts Magnus's ritual. Magnus was forced to fight him and kill him, and Magnus did it over and over again. He beheaded Vulkan, and that didn't work. He turned the Lord of Drake's lungs into amber, drowning him, and many, many other very interesting deaths. But Vulkan came back every time, forcing Magnus to reconsider just what he was doing and how he was doing it. So, unable to defeat Vulkan, Magnus telepathically projects into his mind as his old self, noble and heroic, and he tries to explain everything, but he might as well have been Alfarius trying to explain himself to Dorn. Vulkan wasn't hearing any of it. He told Magnus off, letting him know that if he wasn't a heretic sorcerer, then he wouldn't have ended up a slave to chaos. Everything Vulkan said was true. But outside Vulkan's mind, in the webway, Vulkan was standing over Magnus, ready to deliver the killing blow, and the Emperor's voice was telling Vulkan to slay his brother. But he stole his hand, and he did not bash Magnus to death, which allowed Magnus to cast a spell that obliterated Vulkan, disintegrating him on the atomic level. But before he fell to dust completely, Vulkan smashed his hammer down on Magnus and exploded him, sending him back to the warp to reform in time. Vulkan was able to walk away from that. He regenerated, despite Magnus's best efforts to give Vulkan a true death and end him forever. And the Emperor is leaving for the Vengeful Spirit with Sanguinius and Valdor and Dorn and the Custodes as Vulkan is returning. And I honestly think that sending Vulkan up against Horus would have worked a lot better than Sanguinius. But yeah, Vulkan was ordered to guard the Golden Throne in Malkador as he sat upon it in the Emperor's stead. And if the traitors were to breach the throne room, to activate the Talisman of Seven Hammers and destroy all of Terra, denying Horus the homeworld of mankind. Then, Big E and his posse go off to face Horus. And the traitor forces on Terra get to the point where they are about to cross that line. So Vulkan, he starts to activate the talisman. Malkador knows that hope is not yet lost, but he's totally frying like bacon in the microwave sitting on the Golden Throne, and he can't even talk. So he's watching in horror, basically, as Vulkan is activating the ultimate doomsday device. And then Octe's voice is broadcast across Terra, and it tells everyone that all hope is not yet lost, and the Emperor still lived and was battling on against Horus. So Vulkan, it turned out, was the right man for the job. The traitor Horus Lupercal is defeated, and the traitor legions on Terra turn tail and run. Vulkan's patience and strength proved the right tools to be used after all, where the Talisman of Seven Hammers was concerned. But then Dorn and Valdor show back up with the shattered body of the Emperor, and Vulkan is there as his father is interred upon the Golden Throne, never to move again. But then again, Warhammer 40k is turning 40 really soon. Anyway, Vulkan didn't really want his legion to have to adhere to the Codex Astartes that Guilliman came up with, and for good reason. He didn't even have 1,000 guys left. The Salamanders didn't need to be broken down into chapters. But still, he waged war on the traitors, and especially took offense to the Emperor's children because of the atrocities they inflicted upon the people of Terra. He went on a rampage against them. But then, he just up and walked away. Just like his brother Leman Russ, he walked away from being the leader of the Salamanders, and nobody saw him for 1,500 years. At least, that is officially recorded in Imperial records. But 1,500 years after the Emperor was put on the throne and he hunted down traitors during the Scouring, Vulkan reappeared during the War of the Beast. Vulkan returned to Caldera, and he was fighting an entire orc by himself, just regenerating every time they killed him and fighting an entire horde. It was insane. But then word gets to the Inquisition, and Inquisitor Corland goes and tries to recruit Vulkan for a task he needs help with. Vulkan says he'll do it, but first needs help killing the orcs on Caldera because he'd sworn he'd never see it on fire again the last time he was there. So he'd sworn some oath that he probably took him way too seriously because he's indoctrinated into his own cult, which again I personally see as heresy despite everything. But hey, we all have our own opinions, and I respect if you feel differently. Corland helps Vulkan and then takes him to Terra, where he takes over the Imperium for a while. But then they go to Ulanor and have the intention of slaying the greatest war boss ever, known as the Beast. And this dude is like 10 meters tall. He's huge, and he can totally speak Gothic. He's way smarter than the usual orc, and honestly, when I look at the Beast, I think it looks like the Krork's trying to come back. Like, he's finally a fully cooked orc. But yeah, as orcs get bigger, they get smarter and stronger both. And the Beast was as bad as they've ever come. In my opinion, he makes Gazkul look like Makari. But the war was massive, and the orcs had even set up a capital city and named it Gorkhagrad, which is hilarious. But it all came down to when Vulkan faced off against the Beast in a Gargant turned temple to Gorkan Mork. Vulkan tackled the Beast after he said the orcs were going to wipe out the humans and be our end. They fell into the power generator, and Vulkan became filled to the brim with raw energy, and instead of dying like anyone else would, he channeled it into his hammer, Doom Trimmer, and let loose on the Beast's face like a nuclear blast. It was insane, and it exploded the entire Gargant, and ostensibly, Vulkan and the Beast were both destroyed in the blast. Vulkan has not been seen since, though there are clues he's out there, waiting until his sons are worthy enough for him to return, and they're looking for the artifacts of Vulkan, for he's prophesied to return when they are all found. But then again, the Salamanders are all indoctrinated into the Promethean cult, so of course they're going to be hung up on some religious mumbo-jumbo like that. Of all the Primarchs, Rogal Dorn was the most capable across the board. He was pure willpower, manifested in demigod form, and perhaps the most overlooked son of the Emperor of Mankind, and underrated character in Warhammer 40k lore. His impact on the setting is massive, an impact that only he, the Praetorian of Terra, could have made. But to me, it all comes down to one moment, as if he was created just to be in the right place at the right time. Because without Rogal Dorn and his rash decision-making, the Emperor would not have made it to the Golden Throne. Now, there are a lot of things to talk about when it comes to this particular Primarch, and I'm going to address this one first. But Rogal Dorn is absolutely autistic. A lot of people think this. And my personal experience with that is I found out that I was on the spectrum myself when I was 47 years old. Rogal's never had anyone tell him why he's just a bit different than his peers, and so has had a lot of abrasive interactions with people. But what people don't realize is that he's just wired that way. It isn't that he doesn't care about people or that he's self-absorbed or a narcissist. Rogal is actually one of the most selfless people in all of Warhammer. Okay, so now that that is out of the way, we can discuss just what it is about him that I think makes him the best of the best when it comes to loyalists, far exceeding, in my eyes at least, the rest of his loyalist brothers as far as influence on the setting. Rogal was from an ice planet that was basically a death world called Inuit, and he had an adoptive family and not the worst life of all the Primarchs, but the world was harsh and tribal, and the tribes warred for resources. But of course, like the absolute boss he was, Rogal Dorn conquered the planet and became its emperor. Then he was reunited with the actual emperor, his father, who came and found him during the Great Crusade. And he got along with the idea of the Imperium of Man great, and accepted his role immediately. The emperor was impressed that his son had a fully functioning world-spanning empire, and was ready to go and integrate right into the Imperium. And the kid had the Phalanx too, a ship from the Dark Age of technology supposedly that was found near Inuit. A ship that was bigger than any other in the Imperium and was used as the fortress monastery of the 7th Legion of the Adeptus Astartes, the Imperial Fist Space Marines. The Emperor handed over command of the Fist to Rogal, and the Primarch fell right into his role immediately, with absolutely no hesitation and total loyalty to his father from the moment they met. I mean, it was the exact opposite of the Emperor meeting Angron. They saw eye to eye, and I believe the Emperor probably said, "Son, I am building a galaxy-spanning Imperium of Man and need you at my side." And Rogal probably replied with, "You had me at build." Rogal was given the entire galaxy to forge into something useful, and he tried. It was all he could focus on, do, or care about. Getting the job done, seeing his father's vision achieved, all the blood and the warfare, that was simply part of the means to achieve this greatness. But when Rogal met his Marines, the Imperial Fists, for the first time, he wanted to see what they were made of. He didn't even speak to them, which he probably didn't realize was not the greatest use of his social skills. But yeah, Rogal could be completely oblivious when it came to other people. And it has taken me a long time to come to a place where I don't hold that against him. He only spoke one word to his first captain, Matthias, when he did speak, and after getting to see the Imperial Fists in action. A single word of thanks. And when you get a compliment like that from a guy as stoic and silent and stern as that, especially when you're his gene son, well, that's a commendation of the highest order, honestly. He told his veteran legionnaires that they had much to do and more to learn after he saw them on the field of battle. The only thing he said to them after they'd waited for his approval, or even for him to acknowledge them and speak to them. So, Dorn named Matthias High Marshal, and they went straight into the Great Crusade, expanding the Imperium of Man in the name of the Emperor, forcing worlds into Imperial compliance at a rate only exceeded by Horus Lupercal and his Luna Wolves Legion. Basically, Dorn was able to focus on conquering the galaxy in this particularly methodical way of doing things, utilizing his keen military mind to force compliance to his father's will across the stars. He was good at it. And when Horus was named War Master, he just kept on grinding, unlike some of his brothers who hated the idea. Some, like myself, think that the Emperor should have named Rogal as the War Master. But Horus had one thing that Rogal just didn't. A way with people. 1800 charisma. Rogal was actually a better tactician, a better warrior, probably an all-around better soldier than Horus was. But Horus's Primarch power was his exceptional charisma. He may have just been the single most charismatic bald man that ever lived. So, he was the natural leader. But did Rogal resent that? Not really. Like I said, he just kept grinding. And he was actually cool. When Dorn and the Fist conquered a world and brought it into compliance, they didn't change the laws. They didn't rule or force people to live a certain way. They integrated people into the Imperium and then let them go their own way. Sure, they fought and died for those people, but they didn't see themselves as their masters, which is pretty awesome actually. I mean, all they really took from Worlds was recruits to grow the Legion and replenish lost numbers. And this is what set Dorn apart from Perturabo in particular. The 4th Legion's Primarch took all the spoils for himself. And Dorn, having gigantic brass balls, told the Lord of Iron, "I want recruits, not vassals." And because Dorn was this absolutely amazing conqueror and proved himself completely worthy, the Emperor took him and the Imperial 5th Legion to Terra to be his Praetorians as he built his capital world into something worthy of ruling a million-world empire. And Dorn was given the honor of building the Imperial Palace. This is like letting a kid loose in a toy store. Like, he couldn't have been happier, building away. But Perturabo did feel slighted when Dorn said the palace could even stand against the Iron Warriors laying siege to it, adding to the enmity. Perturabo was definitely fuming just at the thought that Dorn existed, because he was like Perty in every way, just better. So Dorn was the man behind the Imperial defenses and named the Praetorian of Terra by the Emperor. He wasn't the War Master, but in many ways the Emperor pulled a fast one, as the title of War Master brought with it a lot of responsibility and a heavy load of dirty work to be done. But the title of Praetorian of Terra let Dorn stay close by the Emperor's side, his right-hand man, his fist, literally and figuratively. So Dorn is the greatest of the great at this point. He's a man whose name belongs in the same sentence as Horus Lupercal, Sanguinius, Vulkan, Russ, the Lion, and Guilliman. He's the one who is most indomitable, the most capable, the consummate general, and his loyalty cannot be broken. Dorn is a demigod son of the Emperor of a galaxy-spanning Imperium, a perfect son, yet he's an idealist at heart, despite hiding his emotions deep behind stone and steel. Dorn literally never smiles, which makes me realize that he's Russian. Weird I never put that together before. But yeah, he's literally as stoic as they come, but deep down, he does care. And he not only cares about how he and his men are fighting, but he cares why they are fighting. Dorn isn't going to commit murder or get any of his men killed either for some weak cause that he doesn't believe in. Like his Auramite armor, Dorn is incorruptible. He cannot be tarnished. He cannot be corroded. But when his heart gets the better of him, and when his emotions overcome him, he can shake mountains. Storm clouds gather around him in his wrath, and the sky darkens. But that is the only emotion he ever shows. Wrath. But otherwise, he's pretty chill. But he's definitely the guy who you'll never impress, no matter how good you do. You could slay all 4 Chaos Gods, destroy the Dark Eldar, and roach spray 2 whole Tyranid hive fleets out of existence, and he'd maybe give you a slight golf clap, might smirk slightly. You're definitely not going to get a smile or a pat on the back. Rogal is the tough guy on the outside, but inside he's lying to himself. He's actually a bro, and he can almost even form friendships, as long as you're a demigod too. But Rogal did good at spreading the Imperial truth and forcing worlds into compliance. He built the Imperial Palace, he got named Praetorian of Terra, he was on a good path. Granted, there wasn't much upward mobility left, but he was doing great, even for one of the 21 Primarch sons of the Emperor. Until the day when his fleet came across a little ship floating through the void called the Eisenstein. And this is one of those things that it made me really not like Dorn for a long time. But he just flat out did not believe Nathaniel Garro when the loyal Death Guard delivered the message that Horus had indeed turned traitor to the Emperor. So much that he threw a total fit and wanted to execute Garro with Storm's Teeth, his gigantic greatsword, right then and there just for saying the words out loud. But it is also a testament to his character that he did not. From Flight of the Eisenstein, one of my favorite books in the entire Horus Heresy series. "This is what you come to me with?" The Primarch's slow anger filled the room like smoke, heavy and dark. "A convoluted story of treachery and conspiracy among the Emperor's sons? A collection of ill-informed opinions and rash actions made with base emotion and not cold clarity?" He advanced slowly on Garo, and it took all of Nathaniel's courage not to back away. "If I were to have my brothers in this room right now, Mortarion, Fulgrim, Angron, Horus, what would they say of your tale? Do you think that you would even be able to draw a breath before you were struck down for such an outright fiction?" "I know it is difficult to accept." "Difficult?" Dorn raised his voice for the first time and the room shook with it. "Difficult is a winding labyrinth, or a complex skein of navigational formulae. This is against our very creed and character as the Emperor's chosen warriors." He glared at Garo, eyes aflame. "I do not know what to make of you, Garo. You carry yourself like an honest man, but if you are not a traitor and a deceiver, then you can only be possessed by insanity." He stabbed a finger at Cruz. "Should I make a concession for some contagious senility, perhaps? Did the warp addle your minds and create this hallucination between you?" Garo heard the sound of his blood rushing in his ears. Everything was going wrong, falling apart around him. In his rush to find a rescuer for the Eisenstein and a way to get the message out, it had never occurred to him that he would not be believed. He looked away. "Look at me when I speak to you, Death Guard," snapped the Primarch. "These lies you bring into my personal chambers, they sicken and disgust me. That you would dare to say such things about a hero of such matchless character as my brother Horus, it vexes me beyond my capacity for description." He placed a massive finger on the sternum of Garo's armor. "How cheap you must hold your integrity to give it up so easily. I weep for Mortarion if a man of such low honor as you could rise up to command a company of the 14th Legion." Dorn's hand closed into a massive brass fist. "Know this. The only reason I do not tear you limb from limb for your defamation is that I know my brothers will reserve that pleasure for themselves." Garo felt the decking turn to mud beneath his boots, and his chest caught in an invisible vice, returning to him the same sickening sensations that he had felt in the corridor outside the Navis Sanctorum and in the grip of the Xenos warbeast. As he had there, he reached for and found the strength of will that had carried him this far. "My faith." "Are you blind?" he whispered. Dorn was thunder incarnate. "What did you say to me?" "I asked if you were blind, my lord, because I fear you must be." The words came from nowhere, even as some part of Garo marveled at the mad daring of what he was saying. "Only one struck by such a terrible ailment could be as you are. Yours is the blindness that only a brother might have, that of a keen judgment clouded by admiration and respect, clouded by your love for your kinsman, the War Master." It was not often that Rogal Dorn's stern mask cracked, but it did so now. The fury of a god made flesh erupted upon his aspect, and the Primarch drew his powerful chainsword in a flashing golden arc of roaring death. "I rescind my former statement," he bellowed. "Get to your knees and accept your death while you still have the chance to die like an Astartes." And this is after Dorn had already beat Garo up, dislocating his jaw and sending him flying with a punch to the face. I can't imagine a punch to the face from a Primarch feeling very good. But yeah, it took Euphrates Keeler, the Remembrancer, to convince Dorn that Garo did indeed speak the truth. And that made me so mad. Reading about this huge, hulking, raging-pissed Primarch just working over the guy who just escaped Istvan, risking everything to warn the Imperium of Horus's betrayal. It was so rash and so uncharacteristic of his typical reserved stoicism that it took me off guard a bit. Dorn was a raging beast, his blood pressure hitting Angron levels, and it was quite uncomfortable. But unlike some of his more hot-headed brothers, eventually he did listen to reason and see the truth of what was being told to him. Did he apologize for smashing Garo's face and dislocating his jaw? No, not really. But it isn't because he felt that he was in the right. It's just that he feels such things as caring about something like that are beneath him, and he expects that of the men under his command, or any Astartes in general. He holds everyone to the same standard that he holds himself to. but it never dawns on him that he's a Primarch and not like anyone else, even his brothers. But Dorn was Terra's praetor, and so had to defend the solar system, and that is why he was the one who faced Alpharius at the Battle of Pluto. The Alpha Legion was assaulting an astropathic monitoring network on the moon of Hydra, and paving the way for the traitor forces to enter the solar system. And this is where I have a lot of problems with Dorn. As an Alpha Legion fan, first and foremost, it never sat right with me that Dorn killed Alpharius. But he did. There's no denying it. Which means it was probably Omegon pretending to be Alpharius, and then Alpharius pretending to be Omegon pretending to be Alpharius, instead of just Omegon pretending to be Alpharius, who took sole control of the Legion after Pluto. But either way, one of the twins fell to Dorn, which should tell you he's an absolute beast. And it was super brutal. Alpharius, or ostensibly Omegon, pretending to be Alpharius, is trying to talk to Dorn the whole time, trying to explain why they're doing what they're doing. But Dorn doesn't listen at all, doesn't talk except with his strikes and his fury. And honestly, the Praetorian of Terra turned out to be a better fighter and a more ruthless brother than Alpharius. So I can forgive him. I mean, it was his duty. Killed my favorite Primarch, but hey, sometimes secret double agents get killed by their own side because they have to maintain cover. And Dorn wasn't exactly known for his people skills. It isn't like anything Alpharius could have said would have kept him from getting his hands chopped off, impaled by his own spear, his chest cleaved open, and the mighty Storm's teeth brought right down on top of his skull by a raging, pissed demigod. I mean, it wasn't only patricide, it was one of the most brutal deaths ever depicted in Warhammer. I mean, if you love Alpharius, it is very hard to read. If you have any empathy for other humans at all, it is crazy and stomach-churning. I mean, I guess if you're a psychopath, you might get off on it, but to me, it was one of the saddest moments in all of Warhammer 40k. Dorn didn't like killing Alpharius, but it was his duty. Now he got back to Terra to defend it, and this is where we see this Primarch shine. So Dorn gets the Imperial Palace ready to defend, and preps it even harder for the traitor's inevitable attack. And in the book Lost and the Damned, he gives one of my favorite one-liners in all of Warhammer, speaking to the defenders of the Imperial Palace, and broadcast across every speaker and helm, every Vox system in the palace. "The time for speeches is done," said Dorn. "The first great test is here. My order to you all is simple, yet heed it well, and exert yourselves to see it done. They are coming, kill them all." Right there, solidified. Best Primarch ever. Biggest balls. He's got more testosterone than the Marlboro Man and Charles Bronson combined. Kill them all? Dude must be a descendant of Cliff Burton. What a total force. He has wrecking balls for his actual balls. I never, after so many years of being into Warhammer, thought that I would ever be a Dorn fan, let alone that he'd become one of my favorite Primarchs. And yet, here we are. So Dorn, as Praetorian of Terra, was in charge of defending the Imperial Palace when the traitor legions actually attacked Terra. And there are some real banger fights, and the few fists he has with him do their thing. Dorn tries to goad Perturabo into facing him in single combat, but it doesn't work. Perturabo eventually leaves the field, but Dorn does fight Fulgrim at the Saturnine Gate, and Fulgrim tanked a lot of heavy blows from Dorn, and just got shredded eventually, but he was completely holding back. Fulgrim let Dorn know he could easily destroy him if he really wanted to, but he found Dorn to be too boring to continue fighting. Then he left and took his legion, the Emperor's children, with him, and basically quit the heresy completely. But Dorn realized that if Fulgrim had really cared about what he was doing, then the palace could not have withstood him and his legion. Such was the power Fulgrim wielded. He split the walls like they were nothing. Fulgrim could have breached all the way to the Golden Throne, so torqued up he was on the gifts bestowed upon him by Slaanesh. But Fulgrim had grown extremely fickle, and didn't see much point in the heresy, because Slaanesh had also blessed the Phoenician with ADHD. So he went off into space to pleasure himself. Chaos was defeated by its own boredom, and part of that was due to Rogal Dorn being extremely uninteresting to Fulgrim, who pretty much would have stayed until the end even if it meant his own death, as long as it was interesting. But yeah, he got bored. Dorn's stoicism in play once again. But it all comes down to this for me. Dorn was there, standing side by side with the Custodes, Sanguinius, and the Emperor as they went to face Horus on the Vengeful Spirit. And Dorn's journey was messed up. He endured a torment that I shudder at the thought of, the Endless Desert. So when they teleported aboard Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, the party was scattered, and Dorn was sent into a pocket dimension, or a part of the warp, where he was alone in an endless desert with nothing but a black wall in it and the corpses of his fallen sons. And Khorne was whispering to Dorn over and over, constantly, for countless centuries of perceived time. Dorn forgot who he was entirely, and pretty much lost his mind, carving tactics and war memories into the black wall and completely ignoring Khorne. His absolute stubbornness and the fact that he was completely oblivious, like as oblivious as an anvil, eventually wore Khorne out. But he was eventually freed from the Endless Desert when the Emperor cast off the power he'd been building up, letting go of the Dark King aspect he was taking on. And Dorn then found himself in Carcosa, the Inevitable City, where he met Octay. And his memories were back, but he wasn't really well. He was living in the past, worrying and broken down by his experience. Basically, he had Primarch-level depression. It was crippling for him, but he still had a duty and got back on his way. Dorn walks on through the Inevitable City, and eventually he's back on the Vengeful Spirit. He comes across Valdor and some Custodes fighting off Abaddon and the Justarin, and helps Valdor escape. And Abaddon had wrecked Valdor pretty hard. He would have died. But Dorn and Valdor fight their way through the ship and become bros on the way. Dorn basically tells Valdor that he doesn't suck that bad, and Valdor takes it as super high praise. They bro off and hug and go gleefully to their deaths, hoping to face Horus as they get to Lupercal's court. But what they find is not what they expected. Sanguinius and Horus both dead, the Emperor ostensibly dead as well. Only Leto and Garviel Loken were on their feet, still standing. And this is the moment that Rogal Dorn was made for. The culmination of his stubbornness, his intractable will, his unbreakable spirit. For only Dorn was capable of such denial as was necessary for the Emperor to be interred upon the Golden Throne. The only son who would be blinded by his own selflessness and project that onto his father, despite his suffering. Dorn realized the Emperor was still alive. Some blood angels show up, and he orders them to see to their father Sanguinius. Loken stays with Horus. Dorn recovers the skull of Ferrus Manus from Horus's Satan altar of skulls he'd taken, or had someone else taken his name. And then Leto and Valdor are arguing about tarot cards. Leto saying that the Emperor may be talking to them through the cards. But Valdor's like, dude, are you tripping? But Dorn, he's just like really on board with the tarot trip and decides that Leto is right. Even though he thinks the tarot is dark and creepy and he wants nothing to do with it, he knows his father and Malcador both used it and believed in it extensively. The Knight of Mandasio, the Throne, the World, the Orphan, the Revenger, the Despoiler, all cards lying around from the Emperor's deck. Dorn is rash and quick to jump to conclusions, though he is right. Or is he? But Leto shows the card closest to Big E is the Throne, and it is covered in his blood. Dorn knows that this is a sign, and he then orders them to depart back to Terra from the Vengeful Spirit. He understands absolutely clearly that the Emperor wishes to be interred upon the Golden Throne. Dorn wants his father to live. He's got PTSD from the Endless Desert, and he isn't thinking clearly. Not really. He just knows the Emperor's wounds cannot be healed, and that the Master of Mankind will die. It is one of the saddest moments of the lore, and is glossed right over. But yeah, Dorn wants to save his father and cannot, so turns to desperation, the occult, mumbo-jumbo, the arcane, easily misunderstood means of divination, that is the tarot. And in his authority, he declares his own vision to be clear and truthful, and his father's will. He knows the throne will sustain his father. Dorn tells Leto that he doesn't like tarot cards. They kind of haunt him, and Malcador had showed him things that messed him up, including that moment. But he realizes that, like them or not, he must adhere to what they say. And the throne card lying in the dust of Kai Kaltis, next to it the Revelation card, Kai Kaltis Dusk. Dorn notes the sigil symbol that Malcador put on Dusk's armor. They bear Sanguinius's body and Ferris's skull along with the dying Emperor back to Terra. Dorn's stoicism is all that allowed him to accomplish the task of getting the Emperor's body back. Other Primarchs may have broken at the sight of their father and brother shattered, but not Dorn. He did what must be done and kept his head clear and level, despite having just come through hell itself, through the siege of Terra, through the endless desert, and those centuries of constant temptation and torment. Dorn had such an indomitable will that it could not be deterred in any way, shape, or form. But it is this indomitable will that saw his father interred on the throne, to be endlessly dying and tortured for eternity, to experience unimaginable terror and agony every moment of every day, and each moment is galactic in scale and without the bonds of time, a miniature eternity of terrible pain and torture. Or so Malkador lets us know as we see his thoughts right at the end of The End in the Death Part 3, right as he's removed from the throne and turns to dust, consumed, mind, body, and soul, and confined to oblivion. Malkador lets us know exactly what kind of horror Dorn is subjugating his father to. But that even if he could communicate that to Rogal, he would not, as it was all the hope that was left in the Imperium. It's dark, but the Emperor's not having a good time at all on that throne. So Rogal goes into mourning and wears all black, and goes crusading around during the Scouring. But he doesn't want to adhere to Guilliman's Codex Astartes and sends his legion on a suicide mission, the Iron Cage of Perturabo and the Iron Warriors. But that's the subject of another video. But Dorn fought on, just killing to cope with what happened and blaming himself for everything and thinking everyone else was judging him like it was all his fault, and it was not. So that's when he straps into the pain glove and nearly goes full Slanesh as he gets off on torturing himself physically to try to deal with his guilt, even though Dorn would be cut down by Chaos Space Marines during the First Black Crusade of Abaddon, the Despoiler. Now, the original lore was way cooler and involved the Fists keeping Dorn's skeleton in amber, but now they have a hand that they were able to recover, and they believe the rest of the Primarch is still out there fighting on and will return. But they're massively coping. Dorn was pulled into a mob of angry Chaos Marines. Basically, he'd have been picked apart like a wounded buffalo by a pack of jackals. And if he did survive, or was taken hostage, then Abaddon has had him for millennia. And what the War Master has done with Dorn, well, we can only imagine the horrors the Praetorian would have had to endure. So I think he's a better Primarch than Guilliman in pretty much every way, but wouldn't have made much of a mini-emperor like Rabute did. Still, I would love to see Rogal Dorn return to Warhammer 40k no matter what toll it took on the lore to do so. He's perhaps the only Primarch that is what he was made to be, and nothing more or less. A general to conquer the stars and lead legions of super soldiers. When it comes down to it, Rogal Dorn is the best of the best at that. Or he was. Who knows what Millennia in the Warp, or as a prisoner of chaos, would have done to him. He was already having a hard time not internalizing his guilt. But hey, we have the Emperor's sword and his shield in the form of Guilliman and the Lion. Why not bring out the Emperor's fist? Give Rogal that power claw of his father's. What could it hurt? Lorgar Aurelian's name always comes up when the conversation turns to which Primarchs are the worst. I mean, we all know that he's nearly as hated as Erebus, but is that reputation well earned, or does the Urizen get the short end of the stick? The only Primarch who didn't want to be a general, who didn't even want to be a soldier, Lorgar of the Word Bearers, was destined to become the most vindicated man in the Imperium, as the entirety of the Imperial cult is based on his teachings from his book The Lectitio Divinatus. The Archfiend, the first heretic, and probably the most powerful demon Primarch, Lorgar, is very misunderstood. Not that most people don't know what a terrible, vile villain he is, but most people don't seem to understand just how strong the Emperor's Herald is. Let's put it this way, when Lorgar turned his wrath on Fulgrim, when the War Master summoned the traitor Primarchs to meet for the first time, nobody could step to Lorgar. Not even Horus could stop him. As the War Master put his hand on Lorgar's shoulder, Lorgar commanded him to remove it, and Horus could not stop himself from obeying. Lorgar basically used the voice from the Bene Gesserit in Dune. So we all know that the choir boy isn't a fighter, but he is hella strong in the psychic ways. And there are some major scraps he's gotten into over the years with his brothers and other super being, god-tier beings. And none are worse or more misunderstood than his fights with Corvus Corax, the Primarch of the Raven Guard, the 19th Legion of Space Marines. So let's look at his fight with Corax from the First Heretic. So it's during the Drop Site Massacre, and Corvus is charging the Word Bearers and wrecking them as hard as he can to buy time for at least some of his sons to escape the treachery and carnage to live and fight another day. It's pretty balls out, and a total Corax move if you ask me. But even though Corvus is Corvus, and he's going totally apeshit on the Word Bearers, and even though he's not a good fighter and knows he could easily die, Lorgar steps up to fight the Raven Lord. Corax evaded the Crozius without even once parrying. He weaved aside, threw himself out of reach, or fired his flight pack with enough force to boost him up and over Lorgar's heavy swings. By contrast, sweat stung Lorgar's eyes as he desperately blocked each of his brother's attacks. Illuminarum's great hammerhead rang like a church bell as it battered aside the Raven Lord's claws. "What are you doing?" Corax cried into his brother's face as their weapons locked. "What madness has taken you all?" Lorgar disengaged, hurling Corax backward with enough strength to leave his brother unbalanced. The Raven Lord compensated instantly, his flight pack breathing fire and propelling him back at his brother. Bladed wings flashed out at the side, but Lorgar was ready for them. He ignored their scraping, cutting wounds as they knifed through his armor, and focused on hammering Corax's claws aside. In the second safety he brought for himself, Lorgar, at last, landed a true blow. Corax was sent sprawling again as the Crozius pounded into his breastplate. The power field around the Maul's head struck with enough force to send a shockwave blasting out from the warring brothers, throwing all nearby Astartes to the ground. In less time than it took to breathe in, Corax was back on his feet, thrusters firing, spearing at Lorgar once more. "Answer me, traitor!" the Raven Lord grunted. His dark eyes were narrowed at the sickening light that haloed Lorgar. "You are a poor reflection of our father with that psychic gold." Lorgar felt himself slipping back in the mud, his boots grinding across the earth as his brother's strength leaned heavier against him. He couldn't break the weapon lock this time. Both Corax's claws clutched at Illuminarum's haft, burning the handle in the Word-Bearer's hands. "I am bringing the truth to humanity," Lorgar breathed. "You are destroying the Imperium. You are betraying your own blood." The wildness in the Raven Lord's black eyes was something Lorgar had never even imagined before. Corax had always seemed so taciturn, so devoid of passion, that this warrior lay beneath the albino facade was a horrendous revelation. The claw tips, spitting with crackling power fields, were a finger's length from Lorgar's face now. "I will kill you, Lorgar." "I know," he spoke through gritted teeth, feeling strength bleed from his bones. "But I have seen what will be. Our father, a bloodless corpse enthroned upon gold and screaming into the void forever." "Lies!" The black eyes narrowed, and the Raven Lord's pale muscles bunched, locking harder. "You are reducing a kingdom to chaos, overthrowing the perfect order." Lorgar's gray eyes danced with light despite the strain on his body. "The opposite of chaos is not order, brother. It is stasis, lifeless, unchanging stasis." With the last grunt, Lorgar's strength gave. Quivering hands could no longer keep his brother's weapons back. "Here it is," Corax promised in a hiss, his saliva flecking Lorgar's eyes and cheeks. "Here is the death you so richly deserve." The claws reached his brother's face. Slowly, the metal burning hot, they sliced over Lorgar's golden skin, inch by inch, blackening the golden flesh, cutting into the meat of his cheeks. Even should he escape, he would bear these scars until the day he died. He knew this and did not care. The psychic fire wreathing them both flared in response to Lorgar's pain. Corax closed his eyes to spare the sight. An instinct cost him his quick victory. Lorgar threw the Raven Lord back again. Illuminarum rose, ready to strike, before a burst of smoky fire launched the Raven Lord up from the soil to come down on Lorgar from above. The word-bearer smashed the first claw aside, striking the fist with enough force to shatter the gauntlet completely. But even as scythe-long claw blades span off into the surrounding melee, the second claw struck home. Meter-long talons sank through Lorgar's stomach, the tips glinting to the side of his spine as they thrust from his back. Such a blow meant little to a Primarch. Only when Corax heaved upwards did Lorgar stagger. The claws bit and cut, sawing through the word-bearer's body. Illuminarum slipped from the impaled Primarch's fists. Those same hands wrapped around Corax's throat, even as the Raven Lord was carving his brother in half. "For the Emperor!" Corax breathed, untroubled by his weaker brother's grip. Lorgar crashed his forehead against Corax's face, shattering his brother's nose, but still he couldn't free himself. The Raven Lord gave no ground, even as a second, third, and fourth headbutt decimated his delicate features. "But he lied to us," Lorgar spoke through lips that produced more blood than language. "Father lied." The claws jerked, snagged against Lorgar's enhanced bones. Corax tore them free, inflicting more damage than the first impaling had done. Blood hissed and popped as it evaporated on the force field blades. "Father lied," Lorgar said. He was on his knees, hands clutched over the ruination of his stomach. Corax's black eyes gave nothing away. He stepped closer, his one functioning claw raised to execute his brother. "Do it," Lorgar snarled. The psychic wind, the misty fire, all were gone now. He was as he'd always been, Lorgar, the 17th son, the image of his father, the one soul in 20 who'd never wished to be a soldier, and here he would die at the heart of a battlefield. The foul irony of the moment settled on his shoulders, feeling grotesquely apt. He couldn't move his legs. His body was a temple to nothing but pain. He could barely even see his executioner, for his psychic efforts had left him quivering with both weakness and a vision-blurring ache in his mind. A faint outline met his gaze, the blurred image of scythe blades raised high. "Do it!" Lorgar screamed at his brother. The claw fell and struck opposing metal. Corax looked to meet eyes as black as his, and a face as pale as his own. His claw strained against a mirroring weapon, both sets of blades scraping as they ground against each other. One claw seeking to fall and kill, the other unyielding in its rising defense. Where the Raven Guard Primarch's features were fierce with effort, the other face wore a grin. It was a smile both taut and mirthless, a dead man's smile once his lips surrendered to rigor mortis. "Corax," said the other Primarch. "Curse," Corax said the name as the curse it was. "Look into my eyes," said the progenitor of the Night Lord's Legion, "and see your death." So yeah, Lorgar barely makes it out alive, totally eviscerated, guts hanging out. If Kurz didn't save him, then Corax would have won entirely. But this is during the heresy, before either of the Primarchs had ascended. And now, after the heresy, once Lorgar has become a demon prince of Chaos Undivided, in my opinion, he may just be the strongest Primarch. But as interesting as the fight was in the first Heretic, the rematch we see in the short story Shadow of the Past is that much more. In it we see two veritable warp gods throwing down in a way that is almost reminiscent of the final battles with Horus. There are a few elements of that level of Primarch warp-fueled fury that we saw when Sanguinius faces the War Master. Now, this is the last time we see Lorgar described, and that is not too long after the heresy. Still in Millennium 31, if I am not mistaken. By this point, Lorgar and Corvus have both become so much more than they were the first time they fought one another. And even though Corvus knew this, he goes into the fight thinking of the last time he had Lorgar at the mercy of his blades, guts hanging out, ready to deliver the killing blow. He hasn't let go of that moment, and how it made him feel, or how destroyed Lorgar was. Despite getting in a few good licks, the Urizen was wrecked. He's also counting on it being as one-sided as it was before, and Kurz not being there to stop him from finally ending his corrupted brother. And Lorgar, he's scared, as he should be. He knows that it is likely that this time the Raven Lord will end his life. But he's a total boss and actually a very caring father, so he strides out to meet the Primarch of the 19th in combat and allow his sons to escape the wrath of the Crow Demon. kind of mirroring how Korax charged some of the word bearers to allow some of his Raven Guard sons to survive at Istvan V. This is no demon, Lorgar raised his rod, beckoning to the blood-stained whirlwind tearing through the last of the Dark Apostle's warriors. Come to me, brother. With a last flurry of activity that turned another legionary to shards of ceramite and ribbons of flesh, the apparition coalesced into a recognizable figure. It was of equal height to the demon Primarch, clad in black breastplate with long taloned gauntlets. A pair of wings stretched from its ornate backpack, fashioned as intricate metallic raven feathers. The face was as pale as snow, gaunt with eyes as dark as coal, framed by shoulder-length black hair. Kalta Ar felt his breath dying in his lungs as he looked up at the unmistakable features of Corvus Corax, the Primarch of the Raven Guard. A flurry of questions flooded his thoughts, but all remained unanswered as Corax spoke. What has happened to you, brother? I have ascended, said Lorgar. He indicated Corax with a twitch of his rod. I might ask the same of you. The Raven Lord strode forwards, intent on Lorgar Aurelian. Kalta Ar and his warriors scattered before him, grateful to be free of his wrath. Marduk and his coterie closed about their Primarch, but a look sent them away. I am what I have always been, said Corax. I am vengeance incarnate. I am justice delivered. This place, beyond the veil, has revealed what we all are. Underneath the veneer of humanity our Father crafted for us, we are of the warp. Have you come to make oath to the powers that are your true creator? No, I swore to destroy all chaos taint from the galaxy. You will be the first fallen brother to die beneath my blades. I am not the creature you fought at Istvan, said Lorgar, raising his mace. Nor am I. Kalta Ar barely followed the lunge of Corax, so swift it was. A black wind threw him aside as dark fire crackled from the rod of Lorgar. With a thunderous shockwave that hurled the word-bearers to the ground, the two demigods clashed. After a long life of bloodshed and devotion to the true gods, there was little that awed Kalta Ar. The sight of the two Primarchs battling within the Empyrean sphere left him shocked and breathless. Infused with the raw primordial force, the combatants were ablaze with power. Corax seemed a towering storm wreathed in white lightning, the cloud formed of multitudinous ravens. Their cawing was deafening, the flash of their talons and beaks, the spark of the tempest. In the shadow, Lorgar rose like a fireball, alight with a tornado of burning rune shapes. Meteoric sigils rained down on the raven tempest, cleaving ember-edged furrows through the dense mass. They slammed into the buildings around the bridge arch, shattering masonry, incinerating the corpses of Corax's victims. The Raven Lord struck back, hails of flaring claws ripping the air itself, leaving rents through the rune robe of the Urizen. Each stroke left a shriek in its aftermath that shredded the nerves as much as the talons shredded Lorgar's immaterial form. Kalta Ar flinched when the sweeping head of the word-bearer's mace slammed into the chest of his storm-wreathed foe. The impact was greater than any thunderclap, leveling the walls around them. Rolling to his back, shattered stone pouring from his armor, the Dark Apostle watched the titanic combatants soar past, Corax with a quartet of gleaming spear talons driven through Lorgar's throat. The Urizen tried to lash out with his mace, but was held close by the Raven Lord's inhuman grip. Together, they crashed to the ground, their impact flattening again the few word-bearers that had regained their feet. The portal bridge! Marduk's shout drew Kalta Ar's attention to the wavering energy field within the archway. Dark sparks rippled across its fluctuating surface. It was visibly weakening. We cannot be trapped here, declared the Dark Apostle, stepping towards the waning portal. It is sustained by the Urizen's will, declared Marduk, intercepting him. It means our master is losing his power. The two Primarchs had assumed fully humanoid form again in the heart of the crater their fall had made. Lorgar's left shoulder sagged, his rod swaying low in his grasp. Rune shapes crawled across his form, no longer a robe of office, but forming armored plates etched with warp symbols. Corax flexed claws like sword blades, his expression pitiless as he took a step towards Lorgar. Marduk opened fire. The flare of his combi bolter hit the Raven Lord in the chest and face, a welter of detonations that rocked his stride. Kalta R fired his plasma pistol on instinct, the blast hitting Korax in the midriff, splashing cerulean energy across his ornate black warplate. Other fire joined it, missiles and more bolts from Marduk's guard. Lorgar summoned a nimbus of power and threw out a shield of force that lifted Korax from his feet, buckling his wings in the unearthly hurricane. The Raven Lord became a flock once more, of fire-eyed blackbirds, but the swell of Lorgar's will continued to hurl the other Primarchs' incarnations upwards, scattering them to the sky. "Quickly, our lord," shouted Marduk. Lorgar lumbered towards them, his wounds streaming tiny crimson runes like blood. Kalta R looked up. The Raven Lord gathered again into a single mass, a dark comet headed directly for them. The Urizen was first through the portal, his massive frame leaving a shadow of his passing as the other word-bearers dashed through after. Kalta R lunged the last few strides, throwing himself headlong into the miasma under the arch as chill shade swallowed him. He found himself in a large chamber, colorful mosaic underfoot, the walls covered with fresh murals, white vaulted ceilings, and domes far above. Part of the Templum Inficio. He had no time for his surroundings, eyes drawn back to the gate. Shrieking, the raven flock scratched and pecked, but they could not pass the warp barrier. Lorgar glared at the apparition on the far side, chest heaving as though out of breath, his head crowned with a halo of black warp fronds. Korax assumed his mortal shape again, one cheek bloodied and bruised, his eye almost closed. There was much damage to his armor, but he leaned close to the portal, eyes boring through the divide. "I have your scent now, Lorgar," growled the Raven Lord, his face contorted with monstrous rage. "I will find you, Lorgar. I will destroy you and every vessel you have filled with your taint." Lorgar staggered away, and the portal arch fell dull, leaving only bare stone within its pillars. "We can assemble a force in return, our lord," said Marduk, hurrying after the Primarch. "All is not lost," promised Kalta R, not wishing to seem any less dedicated. "I will rebuild the Beneficta Diabola." Their entreaties continued as they followed Lorgar through the corridors and halls, heading towards the center of the grand construction spreading across their new capital of Sicarius. Stairs took them high, to the tower at the heart of everything. Black doors opened at Lorgar's approach as he strode within, no word uttered, no backward glance. With a noise that echoed in Kalta R's soul as much as his ears, the doors slammed shut, leaving him and Marduk on the threshold. There was no handle, no keyhole, nothing by which they might open the edifice. A white Colchizian rune burned into life upon the door, and another. "Deny fate," read Kalta R. He turned to the first acolyte. "What does that mean?" Okay, so Corvus and Lorgar are both way stronger now. The veneer of their humanity stripped away further as they become one with their true essence and their primordial selves, the warp gods they were crafted from. And they both seem to know this. Now, what I find funny is how Lorgar and Korax are both described as a literal warp storm. And Lorgar is known for having his crown of light, but when we see him tear out of the veneer of his flesh and ascend into his warp form, it is interesting that this being is dripping with glowing runes and sigils as his armor, essentially. We see a Lorgar that is not only of the warp, but a Lorgar that is the warp. He's one with it, a truly powerful transcendent being, but I don't think that he is prepared for his brother to be the same, in touch with the warp power that resides in and comprises all of the Primarchs. Did Lorgar lose so badly that he deserves the ridicule he gets from the community? No. Would he have lost and died were he to have continued the fight? Very possibly, yes. But the thing that really gets to me is after the descriptions of him being a warp-ascended being, and especially after the description of his halo of dark warp fronds, how people still can't wrap their head around how it was Lorgar who appeared in Hammer and Bolter Return to Cadia. I don't know. Is it just a fashion statement that regular demons wear fronds of light that shift into halos of dark warp fronds? I find frond to be quite a specific term, and yet the depicted demon on Return to Cadia does indeed have warp fronds. I'm sorry if it doesn't coincide with your personal narrative, but the demon in Return to Cadia is the demon Primarch Lorgar. All signs are there. No amount of piling on, dissing the argument, or bloated Brits bloviating on massive channels about how it isn't him will change the fact that Games Workshop has delivered, and no amount of gaslighting is going to make me stop seeing what is right in front of my eyes. People get too hung up on the Horus Heresy depiction of the Urizen, and need to embrace the fact that we've not seen him depicted in the 41st millennium yet, and what he became may not be in line with their vision, but it is absolutely badass nonetheless. Anyway, I strongly suggest that you judge Lorgar based on what the actual text says about him, and the last time we see him is in Shadow of the Past. So look at that amazing story. He didn't lose the fight like a bitch and run and is in hiding in the warp from Corvus. He did save his sons and lived to fight another day, and retreated to Sicarius where Corvus could not follow. And on the other side of the token, Corvus Corax did not stay outside Lorgar's door for 10,000 years to harass him. Corax can become something terrible in the warp. But we see him return to his regular superhuman form. He isn't entirely transcended, nor is he truly a demon as many suggest. What do you think? Is the Lorgar versus Corax fight misunderstood,